Okay, this is just some generic speculation into some basic topics around the formation and the structure of the personality regarding the specialization or the of subtype essentially. So within metatype. Uh, there is a classification of subtype, the three gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas, um, which I think might also themselves hold the key to understanding why there is this unique organizational workflow, why the sequence goes worship, declaration, answer, prayer, devotion, oath, um, starting at different. Anyway, maybe that organizational workflow itself is dubious. Anyway, so working from that empirically observed uh, basis, that there is this particular sequencing between those relays, um, which form this sort of naturally occurring persistent sort of sequence. I've just been sort of speculating as to like the functional difference of the different subtypes in terms of what is how they develop, why, which doesn't answer the question why that natural cadence of that pattern of that regular sequence, why the sequence has that natural flow. But anyway, so I think it all works back from the oath, that there is something special about the devotion and the oath, um, because they both emanate from the ego's parent function, which I consider is the first awakened node, um, that is produced in the image of the false ego complex, um, out outside of the genesis of the false ego complex, which happens within the superego. So the superego is the first mover, and the first recipient is essentially the oath and the devotion. And then what's very problematic is that the oath itself is within its own relay, and in some sense, for the oath to occur, the devotion has to already have happened. And so you've kind of got a chicken and egg sort of paradox here. And so the earth has to bootstrap itself with a virtual devotion. And then, so, which maybe I used to call it the secret devotion, but now I think I might as well just call it the anchor devotion. And so the devotion itself has to be anchored in something else, or in something in particular. And so the virtual devotion, which is which is in some sense anticipated within the oath, the initiating oath, has to have a model of why its devotion is justified, why its devotion exists already, or something like that. So something has to be elected as something that anyway, and perhaps I've got some of these things backwards, but I think that this might relate to the description of the false ego complex, which I extract from what's written in the book of Revelations, where it talks about that there are 7 horns, and what the horns symbolize is that there are 5 kings that are fallen, 1 king that is, and 1 king that is yet to come, and an 8th as well is spoken of, and it says the 8th is of the 7. So there are 8 objects in that array. So perhaps the oath is the king that is, and the anchoring devotion, the virtual devotion, is the king that is yet come. And then between the oath and the let's say the anchor of the guna, which is anticipated within the anchor of the virtual devotion. So the virtual devotion has to establish itself out of yet another commitment. So, which is ironic because not ironic, but in the case of Rajas is a bit special, because in Rajas the devotion itself is both the virtual devotion and the guna anchor is both the so sort of anyway oh man, so this is going to be slightly weird to explain. So if I'm right, sattva's guna anchor is the worship, which is the furthest away from the oath. So that would mean that the sattva has a secret devotion, or a devotion anchor, which is it's going to anticipate a devotion which is itself premised in an image of the worship. So the seed or the kernel of a sattvaic false ego, the image of a sattvaic false ego, comes from the worship. And so if you look at the distance between the worship and the oath, it's all 6 objects. It's worship, declaration, answer, prayer, devotion, oath. So that means that a sattva has to have, I think, a full blueprint, essentially, of the false ego complex. And so they are much more aware of their own internal composition, because they have the largest self-reference within their... So I think that they are capable of accessing in a more immediate form their circuitry. Their circuitry is much more is much more on hand. I also think that this would also allow for a certain level of self-control, which other gunas might not have as much of. And what I mean by self-control is quite a technical thing, and this is also a speculative thing that I've been thinking about. But is that basically between these relays, in which there are basically 2 major circuits, and only one of them is properly uninterrupted, which is the devotion, oath, worship, declaration circuit. So and you can sort of write this out. So for example, the worship is the subconscious parent function tracing itself in the unconscious inferior, which is also the ego's base. So the worship is basically just the subconscious parent function. The declaration is the subconscious parent function leading, in some sense, you could take it as leading the ego's parent function via the superego's inferior function or the subconscious base. So you can actually see that, like, there are always sort of there are two types of I can't remember the old jargon that I used to use, but I used to call them themes and presentments. So you get one type of thing, which is basically just a kind of, the parent function is mirroring itself in a in something else's inferior function, and the other one is basically that that a parent function is actually leading another parent function via the tracing that was left behind of it in the inferior function that was already set up for it, which is why essentially that second thing is essentially anticipates that something else has already happened. What is my point here? So I'm thinking about other things as well now, but anyway, the thing that relates to the issue of self-control is that basically you can then understand that when one parent function is controlling another parent function via a shared node of inert, let's say, inferior function that is being the bridge connecting the two and allowing the one parent function to lead the other parent function, that whatever dormancy, whatever passivity that of control which is being so if the leading parent function is actually is a kind of dormant in terms of how it's leading that base, which what I'm saying is a bit of a trick, a linguistic trick, or I don't, because in some sense I'm going to turn around and say actually it's not being dormant, it's actually being very, very strict in its treatment. It's going to be sort of strict in a weird kind of ulterior sense, that it's not even conscious that it's being strict when it sees itself as being dormant, because what it's actually doing is it's then when it traces itself up the chain to be led by some later parent function, that when it's tracing itself as being dormant, then the leading parent function over that image that it's traced itself in gets to lead and fill in the or project a kind of leeway of manipulation because that, let's say, obtuseness or that inaneness of the parent function that was being dormant can then, it can be used as a puppet, essentially, animated by how it's being led. And so in that way, the stiffness of, and let's say the stiffness and the dormancy of how one parent function is leading can allow itself to be set up to be manipulated by yet a further parent function, which can then lead it. But in it, while it's leading it, it can be more free in its projection of itself, because that parent function, uh, when it is tracing itself, can trace itself however it wishes to trace itself, because it's going to be treated stiffly on the other side, or it's going to be ignored on the other side. It's going to be treated in a dormant way. So the parent function is controlling the stiffness of the other parent function, and it gets to overact when it's tracing itself, because it's anticipating a dormant reception which will just let it fly. So it can kind of gainsay. And it can essentially, it can do that so much as that it's vigilant on the other side. So in this way, the oath is in a natural position to establish itself out of a kind of circular reasoning, because the oath is connected to the worship, which is connected to the declaration, which is connected to the devotion, which is in turn connected to the oath again. So that is how that circuit lines up. So now, what I mean in terms of self-control, that's an example of self-control. Now, I do think that sattva are capable of balancing that kind of self-control internally more judiciously, because the whole thing has to line up in their blueprint. So I think that sattva eventually, when a certain level of maturity is reached, when a certain level of experience with the false ego complex in middle age or whatever develops, they can actually see their, perhaps their, trace out their own sort of internal folly. Whereas rajas and tamas, I think, are not so gifted, specifically, perhaps for quite different reasons. But I think one of the structural reasons might be is that rajas, if I'm correct about all the stuff about the secret devotion or the virtual devotion that the earth has inculcated within itself, um, rajas don't have an anchor that is, rajas don't have a guna anchor, or a secret devotion that is deep. They just don't, the length of the anchor is essentially non-existent. It's immediate. So the length of the sattvaic anchor is the whole circuitry in some sense, whereas rajas, it's the ground zero of the devotion itself, and the oath itself is. But I think that they still have the other circuitry, but they don't have that other circuitry as part of their core seeded blueprint. So what I think they have is the all their circuitry comes after all their circuitry is like, I mean, I guess, it is going to be related to their anchor, but it's only going to be related by being adjacent to, so sort of their anchor has a large component of adjacent material, but that adjacent material is kind of post hoc in terms of its dependability. So it's kind of like the anchor has a lot of loose rungs, has a lot of uh, um, uh, rope attached to it, but that rope is coiled on the ship, and the anchor sort of is in such shallow water that the anchor doesn't actually, none of the rope is submerged. So that's a bit of a weak metaphor, but anyway, so I think that their other circuitry can be pulled around. Uh, I think it's sort of it has a kind of a level of malleability to it, because it's not really important, but it has to kind of associatively line up, and so it has a fundamental sort of I think it can almost be very fluidly pulled around in connection with the part of the anchor which is prime, essentially. But essentially, because rajas, all of their circuitry, pretty much 2/3 of their circuitry, is like post hoc to the actual part of their anchor, which they actually have a fixed image of, a fixed reserve of planting themselves with. That the rest of what they are is just a kind of associative pull that gets brought along with that small bit of the image which is fixed, which is the anchor. So it has to line up, but man, now essentially then this issue of self-control that I was talking about, sorry, that's really what the whole pull thing has to do, is that if they try to set up a self-control, if a Rajasic personality tries to set up a self-control um, equilibrium, let's just say, I think that I think it's natural to have a self-control, some sort of development of self-control. Obviously, what I'm talking about when I'm talking about self-control is specifically how the devotion is has a kind of has a strange relationship with the declaration in how um, the the dormancy of the declaration is being exploited by the devotion, because the oath is inheriting a kind of a free hand from the worship. uh, and so you're kind of getting a the ego's parent is essentially dominating the subconscious parent in some sense, which is, I would say, just from a kind of what's the word, from a kind of empirical observation. I think that is going to be the more ordinary tendency within psychology in general, just because the parent of the ego develops first, and also having to develop and establish itself and anchor itself. Um, anyway, so I think that Rajas will have a kind of self control. When they do have a self control, they're going to have the devotion, and the oath is going to be fixed, and the declaration is going to uh, be pulled around. But it, in some sense, because the declaration is not in a part of the circuitry, which is, in fact, none of the other parts of the circuitry are, let's say, they're all anchored post hoc. They're all anchored in association with what has already been anchored, or the image of the of the of the guna anchor is already is in the devotion. Um, so you have a virtual devotion, or a secret devotion, or a that is a guna anchor, which is a devotion itself. So it's all happening sort of around the ego parents, and so yeah, and the subconscious parent just has whatever is left over from that, which is not much essentially. So it can sort of, I think, be a kind of stylistically be quite undefined in terms of its identity, in terms of its structure. It can get into a kind of sympathetic enslavement, um, and stay quite undeveloped, because it's just always this kind of post hoc pull. It's always just pulled around in a kind of post hoc fashion. Anyway, um, tamas, and really, I do think it all has to do with where the declaration is, and tamas has a similar kind of thing. Although I think that the tamasic guna anchor is the answer, which is not even in the same circuit. And the answer is connected with the question and the only itself, or the just if is what I used to call it. Which anyway, so the answer in the prayer is sort of is the superego parent and the unconscious parent. So if the answer is the secret devotion, or the virtual anchor for the tamas individuals, sort of bootstrap for their own devotion, in their initiating oath. I mean, I do have to think about this, if I've got this whole description slightly is not It's not a perfect narrative of how these things come together. But how I picture it is that what I'm calling the guna anchor is an anticipated condition or an anticipated emotional tone. So it's like it's a postulated emotional tone which is seen as resident and being acted out by the relevant parent function in the relevant theater or the relevant base or the relevant inferior function or whatever. And when that so that is the king that is yet come. And and I mean, I guess I don't have the narrative all worked out because it doesn't even exactly quite make sense. But somehow, because that king is not yet come, this seems somewhat paradoxical perhaps, the oath is the king in anticipation of that king that is yet come. So it has to be regarded that that emotional tone, that condition, in some sense, should be true, but is not yet true, but that it should be true. So it's kind of tentatively, so based on the hypothesis that king is yet come, then uh, the oath is the king uh, in the present, and all the other relays are essentially fallen. Um, which to me is a useful analogy of describing the state of the circuitry of the mind itself, in some sense, that the only relevant, in some sense, the only epistemologically relevant thing in the false ego complex is the oath. Everything else is epistemologically dead. It's fallen. Um, but it still has to be known about, in some sense. Still has to be ordered. It still has to sort of the image of that death, is somewhat inculcated in the beast, which is essentially the eighth, which is the only itself, the just if, the other side of the condemnation. Uh, and so, in some sense, that it all gets as a compendium of as a overarching picture of all of this, in some sense, of which the only active force within the whole thing is the parent function and the ego, which is why that is archetypally the whore of Babylon, and why the only itself, or the just if, the image of the whole sort of death structure itself, the compendium of all of these fallen relays. Anyway, but yeah, essentially it says that the eighth is of the seven. So I see the eighth as being essentially the map of the whole thing, or the overview of the whole thing, but it's kind of fundamentally a note, and well, in some sense the only thing doing anything over that is the superego parent function, which is essentially the false prophet in that state. So, what is the point? What is the point? Oh, so yeah, I just want to say that I do think that the question as well also is almost like the inversion or the reverse image of the beast to some extent, although it's not quite the same content, but it is a kind of associative context. The question has to breathe life into the relay, and I think that it is fundamentally fallen because it's all fundamentally fallen relative to the earth, because the earth knows that it's running on a virtual devotion, that the earth remembers that it initiated itself on a whim, that it's just a game that it's playing on itself. But it has an accompanying question that makes it sort of that makes it seem sort of viable in some sense, or that it makes it make sense within some valence, within some. So the question is kind of like the kind of. I mean, the question is the sort of the forest of the mystery of the immediate consciousness of your sense of your conscience. I mean, that is what though that is your ability to think in your head through you're thinking through the question. um but it's kind of like a rat in a maze, and it's already fallen in some sense, and the only active thing is the only active volitional, the first mover in all of these structures is the earth. Okay, so let me just move on. I've already been thinking about how this potentially translates into some ideas around therapy. So I'm going to talk about that. And let me just also say that before I move on to that, is that the guna anchor will also be essentially mirrored in the question. That the guna anchor, whichever, the beginning of the blueprint, will be the kind of the first act within the question, because the question will have to will be immediately sympathetically generated. I think that the question is developing exactly parallel to whatever is going on in the earth. So, of all the fallen, if it is one of the five fallen kings, it is in some sense the most all encompassing of the fallen kings. Anyway, I mean, I think maybe I already tried to explore what the value of the question is, because in some sense the question can rebirth the false ego complex. It can re-image the false ego complex to some degree, or it can reformulate it within the current structure. It can reorder things. It can move things around. Okay, so I was thinking that maybe that what bipolar aberrant salience might also refer in some in some degree, is the kind of self-control that I was talking about. And I was thinking that maybe that there's a horse trading that goes in between the worship and the declaration. Um, if that is true, I think that would mean that all bipolar type 1 individuals are sattvic, and bipolar type 2 might be rajasic and tamasic, and in some sense they because I can imagine that a rajas would also have the same internal horse trading between the declaration and the worship, but because that is a post hoc, because when the sattva is doing it, they're meddling with their blueprint of their anchor, whereas when the rajas is doing it, they're just reordering the coils of of un of unused anchor that is just associated with it. It's connected with the anchor, but sort of then it's not used as part of the blueprint of the anchor. Mixed metaphor, but it's sort of uh, the the length of the anchor is just not the same, and so anyway, that's perhaps a risky speculation for me to make, just because it's uh, potentially just uh, quite a bit of a rubbish sort of. I mean, it might be just a crazy suggestion. Anyway, what's the other point here? Is that this might mean that if you take a personality and you take their emotional tones, if I'm right about this post hoc pull stuff and the anchor stuff, in terms of that you would be able to see that some emotional tones used would have more fidelity, would essentially have a higher, because in terms of the self control stack, they would have a more basic purchase over the original sort of foundation of the personality style, or the kind of has a is more representative of the kind of the deeper constitution of the false ego complex. And so some of the emotional tones would sort of pivot around the other more fixed ones, would be pulled around by the other more fixed ones. Um, and Rajas then would be cursed in the sense that they would have the most, they would have the most emotional tones pivoting, and they would have the smallest footprint of fixed emotional. I mean, that might actually make them more sophisticated as well. Perhaps I shouldn't be so presumptuous. I mean, essentially, I think that this could have both positive and negative attributes, because that level of internal pivoting could also perhaps be a wellspring of self-knowledge and self ownership to some degree and self-experimentation, which Sattva would never be able to have anything like that, because Sattva doesn't have any post hoc pull to mess with themselves with. They can't fidget with themselves internally like that. Sattva can just see and rewire. They can so sort of Sattva, when they are phenomenologically introspecting, they're kind of like electricians, or sorry, they're what's the word? Electronic engineers, whereas Rajas perhaps and Tamas also then to the same extent are let me think of a metaphor. Man, I guess this are like plumbers, um, or something. I'm just trying to think something hands-on, that sort of hydraulic, where you can kind of it's messy when to reorder the thing, to fix the system. You have to kind of the you have to switch off the water before you can do anything. Yeah, bit of an awful metaphor, but anyway, or maybe a better metaphor would be something about cooking. That sort of timing and doing the right thing in the right steps. I mean, so this is, whereas something that's perhaps electronic, you can substitute time with just sort of having the right tool. Anyway, this is a very weak metaphor, but sort of just trying to say that there's always a kind of overview sort of that Sattva can take, which is somewhat problematic, because I think Sattva might not be able to really connect with themselves as the other ones can, because all of the parts of the circuitry kind of have an equal weight, because they all are interrelated to each other in the view of a kind of blueprint. So it's sort of they can never sort of inhabit the building, they can only see the blueprint. And so they're all just lines, they're all just the same drawing. It's not the same, because they're all interchangeable as lines represented on a blueprint. So they can't feel perhaps the difference between those parts of it. But the exception to this is, let's say, every type, I think, is going to be very sensitive to this button of the guna anchor, that the initiating developmental, let's say, trigger and the virtual devotion is going to have a compensatory sympathetic declaration. And so I wonder if there isn't a solution to every false ego complex in terms of a particular commandment, in terms of a form of a declaration which wouldn't be a particular antidote or panacea to sort of kicking out the the first link in the chain of the associative structure that'll be at the core of the question, but will also be at the center of the oath, or the first act that the oath did in order to bootstrap itself, in order to get itself off the ground. That this might also be, I guess, and now I am venturing into talking about therapy. So I have sort of two ideas here. The one is that let me find my note. The one is that that the declaration is kind of like an aspect. Man, I have to interpret my own drawing now. That the devotion and the declaration. No. That if I could maybe call the devotion as kind of like the meshed circuit that is resulting in a meshed identity, matter, energy, space, and time. It's a Scientology term, meshed. And that the declaration anyway, so there's going to be a lot of strange sympathetic enmeshed around the devotion and the declaration, I guess, is kind of the. But sorry, some of the speculation is somewhat downstream of some other thinking that I did, which is essentially that how important it is to get the theta circuit understanding itself properly, because that needs to be done conceptually. But then the problem is that you still have to fix the incarnated, let's say, identity problem. Let's say residual sort of meshed problems, which will also have a kind of end theta, interpolated theta. That's what end theta refers to. But that they have to actually be conceived of as how the meshed identity is corruptly postulated, or how it was corruptly postulated, and retracing that decision tree. But a way to do that is to develop essentially a rule that one was not abiding by. Now I might be saying things that are not relevant to other people's personalities and their therapy, but I was thinking that the overshot in terms of the declaration, in terms of the sympathy that it was fostering for the devotion, for the virtual devotion, for the guna anchor, is laden within the declaration, and you have to rule out that. You have to clean up the declaration so that you're not fostering that virtual devotion anymore, or that guna anchor, which is in some sense, so there's a kind of passivity or dormancy within the declaration, And so I guess what I'm saying is that I do think that perhaps what I'm generally speculating is that I think that the healing you have to get the conceptual stuff correct, but the actual healing, the holism, and the integration, or at least at the stage that I'm focusing on now, uh, I think perhaps comes from uh, the subconscious undoing the death of the subconscious, which in some sense is only possible after you have some kind of model for the theta circuit stuff, the super ego parent function, cleansing that of the false prophet and all that kind of stuff conceptually, but sort of it's that kind of pure abstract theory in some sense. What it needs to be applied, what it needs to be applied upon, is the messed identity, which I do think is basically the core of the subconscious. Um, and that has a tremendous amount of weight attached to it. It has a tremendous, I mean, that is the history, the whole history, and all that. But anyway, just focusing on essentially the rule that you broke in terms of fostering a sympathy, in terms of your declaration, in terms of your own subconscious parent function, fostering the virtual devotion, or making being dormant, and therefore allowing the guna anchor to take root. Yeah, so I mean, I guess I still need to think about this some more and work out if that has a, a more particular kind of yeah, I guess I'll just have to meditate on this.